In today's video, I'm going to be talking about some of the common terms and phrases that students might want to use if they are talking about comedy literature. So this is maybe for poetry, it might be for prose, it might also be for drama. And these phrases are phrases that come up many, many times as I'm teaching comedic literature. They come up a lot in students' essays, and they're also, I suppose, some of them directly linked to some of the aspects of comedy. In other words, the common ingredients of comedy that we see time and time and time again across multiple comedic texts. So the aim of this video really is to give you a checklist of terms which not only perhaps describe some of the things that you're seeing in the literature, but also to describe the way in which the audience is reacting to that literature and the impact that that comedy may have on a reader or the audience. So it's a relatively simple video. I'm going to just be typing into this as I talk to you and discussing as we go along what these words mean and how they might tie into comedy. Okay, so I'm going to change it to white font and bold, I think. And also use bullet points. So the first thing, and I've already made a video about this, is disequilibrium. So disequilibrium really is about creating deliberate chaos. So a disequilibrium is caused when there's a disparity between what we expect should be happening and what is actually happening. And it's that disparity between what we're seeing and what we think should be happening that can sometimes cause awkwardness, and it can sometimes cause a lot of confusion and chaos on stage. And that is what an audience would be entertained by. So there's a separate video that I've made on my channel a couple of years ago now to do with what disequilibrium is. But it's about deliberately, I suppose, rocking the boat and deliberately relishing this idea of rule breaking and a temporary state of chaos and confusion. Another word that I have become quite fond of, particularly teaching this year, is masquerading. When a character masquerades as something, it means that they are pretending to be something. In effect, they're acting, they might be deceiving someone, both through their personality, they might be acting in a particular way for a particular reason, or they might be, in disguise. And if they're in disguise, or if they're lying about their true identity, or their true feelings, or their true opinions, it means that they're masquerading as something. So that's also quite a useful verb to describe the process of deceiving others. In comedy, we have a lot of lovable rogues, and that's another kind of, I suppose, stock character that comes up time and time again in comedy. If you are doing comedic literature, think about whether your characters are particularly roguish. They mainly, I suppose, apply to men, but they can also apply to women as well. Lovable rogues are essentially characters that we enjoy watching because they give comic relief. Um, we like them, we don't dislike them, but we also enjoy the ridiculous situations that they get in, which is often of their fault. And we enjoy that as an audience. We enjoy characters getting into kind of silly situations. Some characters also suffer from a lack of wisdom, which means that they also might have a degree of gullibility. So, in order for kind of a prank to work, you need to have people that believe in the prank, that don't know it's a prank. So, all of the kind of prank videos that you see on the internet, they only work because they have because the person has been gullible and not realizing it's a prank. And in life, usually what happens is the older we get, the wiser we're supposed to get. So technically, we're supposed to get less gullible as we get older. But in comedy, age doesn't necessarily mean wise. And certainly in some of the Shakespeare plays, particularly Taming of the Shrew, for example, but also in a variety of texts, there are older characters which aren't particularly wise at all. And time and time and time again, they allow other characters to lie to them. And as an audience, of course, we delight in that because we know what's going on in terms of the dramatic irony, but those characters do not. So whenever you're dealing with pranking or tricks, then you're going to have something to do with them being believed. I've already talked about comic relief. Comic relief is that release of tension. And a lot of the time in plays, for example, you will have fool characters or clownish characters who are deliberately on stage at that moment to make sure that there is comic relief there and to break up moments of formality. If you have bought tickets with your own hard-earned money and you've bought tickets to see a comedy, you expect as an audience member to laugh. And if you don't find the play funny, whether it's a Shakespeare play or even a modern play, you're going to not like it and you're going to feel like the play wasn't very good. So, directors and stage and playwrights are very aware that in the genre of comedy, the audience needs to be kept laughing because that's what people have bought tickets for. So, comic relief is often kind of created by particular characters, such as lovable rogues, but also archetypal fool characters. I've also today so far spoken about pranking and another word which is clowning, the idea of clowning around. Very closely linked to jesters. If you think of what a jester looks like in a pack of cards, very kind of silly hat, deliberately kind of characters employed in theatre to act like a clown and to keep the audience entertained and laughing in terms of comic relief. And a lot of the time in comedy, characters do get themselves into ridiculous situations of their own doing because they are kind of determined to deceive. They are determined to play a trick or a prank on somebody else. So, pranking and clowning is often another aspect of comedy that we see time and time again. In comedy, we also spend a lot of time ridiculing characters. Um, those characters might be particularly stupid or foolish, but we also mock pretentious and snobbish characters as well. And there is a huge amount of comedy which is to do with class and to do with class differences, which really, I suppose, celebrates the common man or the common person, the ordinary person, while mocking the snobs and the pretentious people. So, in a comedy, we are encouraged really to ridicule characters, and sometimes even the audience is ridiculed as well, whether that's directly or indirectly. A lot of comedians nowadays take a lot of their material from the audience that is in front of them, and they kind of ad lib and improvise. Comedy always has its origins in kind of improvisation. Tragedy was always more structured, where comedy was a lot to do with the energy and using the audience for a lot of your material. We also ridicule characters that find themselves in kind of silly situations. So I should expand on that. Ridiculing characters in silly situations, often of their own doing. So sometimes characters are the worst own enemy. They put themselves in ridiculous situations because of their deceptions, for example, and the lies they tell. And they get themselves into lots of sticky situations. And as an audience, we kind of revel in that because it makes us laugh. In comedy, think about settings. So sometimes the comedy is made more apparent because of the place where that comedy is taking place. So you might, for example, have a very solemn setting like a church or a funeral where silly things happen. So again, you've got this disparity between a formal setting and something more ludicrous going on. You might also have a setting of a journey, of a home. So always think about settings and how the settings can reinforce the comedic action. Something else that students tend to speak a lot about are stock characters. These kind of types of character that we see time and time and time again. So the innocent woman, the foolish older man or the pantaloon, the snob, the comic villain, the archetypal fool. All of these kind of stock characters that we see embodied in different texts as you go through the centuries of literature. So look out for stock characters as well, because that's probably not the only character of that ilk, of that type, that you will see in literature. Um, Particularly in, I suppose, dramas, but not exclusively. Um, Characters, usually men, but not exclusively, are usually interested in the pursuit of a love interest. So I'm thinking here of The Taming of the Shrew, The Importance of Being Earnest. Both of those texts are to do with characters, mainly men, pursuing a woman because they associate that woman with happiness. And of course, in comedy, there is always a degree of happiness and a sense of happy resolution. So a sense of reconciliation and happy endings. We expect happy endings in comedies because it makes us feel good. Things might not go so well at the closure of a tragedy, for example. So look out for reconciliation as well. Usually, it's the pursuit of a love interest which is more comic than the state of marriage itself. So when we talk about the pursuit of a love interest, it's usually how the characters get to that marriage and that happiness, which is more funny than the state of marriage itself. So it's how the characters are going to achieve that love interest. Usually it's not simple. It's not as simple as going for a drink with them. It can often be more elaborate than that. And that's what the audience enjoys watching. These characters getting themselves into silly situations, as already said. Sometimes comedy can become quite chaotic. And you have this revelry in chaos, also known as Mikhail Baktin's kind of less theory, which I've already done a video about. This idea of revelry in breaking the rules and kind of chaos. So deliberately knowing you shouldn't be doing this, but doing it anyway, and basically saying that's okay. But for more information about the Carnivalesque, I've done a separate video on that in my channel. So in comedy, there can often be a lot of rule breaking and knowing you shouldn't be doing it, but doing it anyway because you know you're breaking the rules and it's fun to do so sometimes. We cannot be serious all the time. So rejection of normality and serious. We cannot be serious all the time. We have to let our hair down occasionally and have a break from what can be a very serious life. So comedy encourages that to happen. I've spoke about the joy of rule breaking. There can also be a sense of transformation. So this idea of characters embarking on some kind of journey. The way they begin the text might be different to how they finish. Something might happen to them that's quite miraculous or quite surreal. So thinking about miracles, surrealism, things that are quite bizarre and supernatural is another way to look at comedy as well. And finally, in this first list, you can also talk about characters that are egotistical, arrogant, pretentious, and snobs. Oh dear. Just change the spellings there. So we can also look out for it as another kind of stock character, I suppose. Look out for characters that are egotistical, they have status, or they think they do. They think they're God's gift. And in comedy, those kind of characters can be mocked completely as thinking they're God's gift, but actually the writer might be suggesting otherwise. It kind of coincides there with the archetypal snog, but you can also talk about the archetypal fool character, which is very much to do with comic relief and very much to do with creating comic relief. Effectively employing in your play or including in your play or your work deliberately a character that's going to do silly things and make mistakes, which is going to make the audience laugh. Sometimes you will have characters that are quite resourceful, and you will have characters who are resourceful, characters who are quite opportunistic, which means they take their chances, but characters that are also quite commanding and are quite resilient as well. So they're also sometimes very good at kind of making up as they go along, thinking on their feet, to have sharpness of mind in order to engage in witty repartee or witty back and forth between characters is something else that you can look out for, particularly when characters are speaking to one another in a text, mainly a drama, but again, obviously characters speak to one another in other texts as well. Characters can also be cunning, but we tend to like them for being cunning. And another good word is unscrupulous, meaning that they, again, might not be particularly 100% right all the time or even moral, but they kind of get away with it. And we quite like the fact that they're a bit of a kind of Jack the Lad, maybe, a bit of kind of a chancer. We kind of like that roguish behaviour. Something else we talk about, the joy of pranks, of course, the joy of clowning around, and the kind of inconsequential atmosphere that can create. Very rarely do people get punished for their pranks in a comedy. Think about asides and the relationship with the audience, particularly in a drama. For example, do you have a play where the fourth wall is broken? So have a look for that. Whenever you see an aside, it's probably because the character on stage is talking to the audience and using the audience as almost its separate character. And that, again, draws attention to the fact that what we're watching here is a construction that is being performed for us. So there's that kind of almost that dialogue between audience and character. Look at language. Look at the tone and vocabulary of language. Look at, for example, irony. Do you have characters that are being ironic and sarcastic as well? You can sometimes have characters that are speaking quite bitterly and mockingly of something, so they're kind of mocking something, perhaps. I've spoken about witty repartee already, I think, somewhere. Yep, so the turn taking between characters and that sharpness of mind, being able to think on your feet quite quickly. Look for the fool character, as I've said, but also think about words like revelry, to revel in something, to carouse, to have merriment, to have mirth. All of these words which are to do with what comedy is about, which is laughter and escapism. Finally, also for this video, also think about using phrases like makes the audience or the reader laugh. It seems simple, but it's true. It's an impact. It's what the writer is wanting, this kind of reaction. Keeps the audience or reader entertained. That's another good phrase to use as well when you're thinking about the effects of comedy on an audience. You can also think about using the audience would find this humorous because, again, making it explicit, the use of humour. And finally, you could say something like the audience delights, or the audience or reader would delight in seeing. So always think about the audience, the reader. This is a construction. This is a text that has been made. Think about the effect on you as that audience or that reader. What would the audience enjoy? What would they find laughable to watch? What would they delight in seeing? Okay, so this is just really, I suppose, a brain dump of all the kind of phrases and all the kind of ideas that I see come up in essays time and time and time again with my students, or to do some way with the aspects of comedy, these kind of ingredients of comedy that we see all the time. But just some kind of vocabulary here that perhaps you might find useful when you are completing your exams or your essays or your discussions about comedic literature. Thank you very much for watching, and good luck in your studies.